Before we begin, I need you to pause and imagine something with me. Imagine you've been told your entire life that when the enemy arrives, they will destroy everything you love. You've heard the stories, seen the propaganda, felt the terror in your bones. You hide your children, you prepare for the worst, you make peace with unspeakable horrors about to unfold. And then, when that moment finally comes, when you see the enemy soldiers walking down your village road, something happens that shatters every single thing you believed. Something so unexpected, so profoundly shocking, that you cannot even scream. You just stand there, frozen, unable to process what your eyes are seeing. Before we dive deep into this extraordinary true story from 1945, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever heard about this moment in history that changed everything for thousands of people in a single afternoon. What I'm about to share with you is not just another war story. This is about the exact moment when humanity broke through the walls of propaganda, fear, and hatred. This is about a day in August 1945, in a small, devastated village in southern Japan, when British soldiers of the Allied occupation forces entered territory that had been told for years that these foreign devils would bring nothing but savagery and destruction. The Japanese women left behind in these villages had been fed a constant diet of terrifying propaganda, stories of barbarism and brutality, warnings that if the enemy ever arrived, death would be a mercy compared to what would follow. They had hidden their children in cellars and rice storages. They had said what they believed might be their final prayers. Some had even prepared crude weapons or poison, choosing a quick death over the horrors they'd been promised would come. The air in that village on that August day was thick with the kind of terror that makes time itself slow down, where every heartbeat feels like it might be your last, where every sound could be the beginning of the nightmare you've been dreading for years. But what happened next would become one of the most powerful, least told stories of World War II. A story about expectations shattered, about the human capacity for dignity even in the aftermath of unspeakable conflict, about how a simple smile can be the most revolutionary act in a world torn apart by hate. This is the story of how British soldiers, led by officers who understood something profound about human nature and the responsibilities of victory, walked into those Japanese villages and did something that left thousands of women absolutely speechless, unable to process what they were witnessing, frozen in a moment of cognitive dissonance so powerful that many of them would remember it for the rest of their lives as the day they learned that not all enemies are demons and not all soldiers are monsters. Let me take you back to that village, to that exact moment, and paint the picture for you with every detail that matters. The war had just ended. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled across radio waves with the unprecedented announcement of surrender. The first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their divine emperor speak. The bombs had stopped falling. The air raids had ceased. But in their place came something even more terrifying to the villagers: the certainty that occupation forces were coming. For weeks, the Japanese military propaganda machine had been drilling into civilians a simple, horrifying message. If the enemy comes, they will show no mercy. The Americans will be brutal. The British will be savages. They will destroy your homes, violate your families, erase your culture, turn your sacred land into a wasteland of suffering. Better to die with honor than to face what is coming. This wasn't just casual wartime propaganda. This was systematic psychological conditioning designed to make civilians choose death over surrender, to fight to the last person, to never give the Allies an easy victory. In a particular village in the south, where green hills met the ocean and terraced rice fields told stories of generations of careful cultivation, the women left behind after most men had gone to war or been killed gathered in secret meetings after the surrender announcement. Old grandmothers who remembered the Meiji era, young mothers with babies strapped to their backs, teenage girls who should have been dreaming about festivals and flowers but instead were learning how to die with dignity. They made their plans. They would hide the children first. They would stay together. They would resist if they could, and if they couldn't resist, they would find a way to end it on their own terms. The village leader, an elderly woman named Fumiko, who had survived the Great Kanto earthquake and raised 7 children alone after her husband died in the Russo-Japanese War decades before, spoke to them with the kind of steady voice that comes from a lifetime of surviving disasters. She told them to be brave, to protect the youngest ones, to remember that their ancestors were watching, and that dignity in death was better than shame in life. When the first reports came that British soldiers had been seen on the roads leading toward their region, the village went into a kind of silent lockdown. Doors were barred. Windows were shuttered. Children were told in urgent whispers to stay absolutely quiet, to Pretend they were not there, to become invisible. The women dressed in their darkest, plainest clothes, removed any jewelry or ornament that might attract attention, and made themselves as unremarkable as possible. Some of the older women, those who remembered stories from older wars, advised the younger ones to rub dirt on their faces, to make themselves look sick or unappealing, anything to avoid notice. The atmosphere was suffocating. Every bird call sounded like an approaching threat. Every breeze through the bamboo felt like the whisper of ghosts warning of what was to come. Time stretched into an agony of waiting. And then, on a morning when the late summer sun was already hot and the cicadas were screaming in the trees, they heard it. Footsteps. Many footsteps. The rhythmic march of military boots on the dusty village road. The sounds grew closer, accompanied by voices speaking in a foreign language, words they could not understand but that sounded to their terrified ears like the growls of beasts. Fumiko, watching from a crack in her wooden fence, felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Next to her, a young mother named Sachiko clutched her 3-year-old daughter so tightly the child began to whimper, and Sachiko had to clamp her hand over the little girl's mouth to keep her silent. All along the village road, behind every fence, in every darkened doorway, women held their breath and prepared for the horror they were certain was about to begin. The British soldiers came into view, and the first thing that struck the women was how clean they looked. These were not the savage, blood-stained monsters from the propaganda posters. These were young men in pressed khaki uniforms, their boots dusty from the road, but their appearance disciplined and orderly. They walked slowly, not in an aggressive charge but in a measured pace. Their rifles were slung over their shoulders, barrels pointing down and away. Some had cigarettes. Some were talking, quietly among themselves. And then, the thing that made absolutely no sense, the thing that caused Fumiko's entire worldview to fracture like glass struck by a stone, these soldiers were smiling. Not cruel, predatory smiles, not mocking, sadistic grins, but soft, almost gentle smiles. The kind you might give to a nervous animal you're trying not to frighten. The kind that says, I see you're afraid, and I'm trying to show you that you don't need to be. One soldier, a young man with red hair and freckles who looked barely 20 years old, noticed movement behind a fence. He could see eyes peering through the slats, wide with terror. He stopped walking, and his companions stopped with him. The tension in that moment was astronomical. The women watching expected him to shout, to raise his weapon, to kick down the fence. Instead, this British soldier did something completely incomprehensible. He smiled wider, raised both of his hands in a peaceful gesture, palms forward showing he held nothing, and then he bowed. Not a mocking bow, not a shallow nod, but a proper, respectful Japanese-style bow, the kind you give to show sincere respect and peaceful intention. The silence that followed was deafening. Fumiko felt tears spring to her eyes, but she didn't understand why. Confusion washed over her in waves. This was not possible. This was not what she had been told would happen. This was not the enemy from the propaganda films and the radio broadcasts and the whispered warnings. Behind another fence, Sachiko slowly lowered her hand from her daughter's mouth, staring at the soldiers with an expression of such profound bewilderment that she looked like someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Up and down the village road, women began to emerge from their hiding places. Not boldly but tentatively, like deer stepping into a clearing where they're not sure if predators are waiting. They appeared in doorways, stepped out from behind fences, moved closer to windows, all of them trying to understand what they were seeing. The British commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named James Montgomery, a career soldier who had fought through North Africa and Burma and seen enough horror to last 1,000 lifetimes, had made a decision before his men ever set foot in Japanese civilian territory. He had gathered his soldiers and spoken to them with absolute clarity. They were not here as conquerors bent on revenge. They were not here to become the monsters that war can make of men. They were here as representatives of something better. Something the war had been supposedly fought to protect. Human dignity, civilized conduct, the principle that even in victory you do not become what you defeated. He had told his men in no uncertain terms that any soldier who showed disrespect, aggression, or improper conduct toward Japanese civilians would face court-martial. But beyond the threat of punishment, he had appealed to something deeper. He had reminded them that these were human beings, that these women and children had already suffered beyond measure, that they were terrified, and that power without mercy was not strength but cruelty. Montgomery himself now stepped forward, removing his cap in a gesture of respect, his weathered face showing the lines of a man who had seen war's ugliest faces and chose to answer with something different. He had learned some basic Japanese phrases before arriving, working with an interpreter to get the pronunciation right. He spoke slowly, clearly, his deep voice carrying down the village road. "We are here in peace," he said in carefully practiced Japanese. "You are safe. No one will harm you. We come with respect for your homes and your families." His accent was thick, his grammar imperfect, but the effort itself was shocking. An enemy officer speaking their language, offering safety instead of threats. The cognitive dissonance was so powerful that several women actually gasped audibly, hands flying to their mouths. But words alone, even surprising words, would not be enough to overcome years of conditioning and terror. Montgomery knew this. He had to show them, not just tell them. He gestured to his men and they began to move through the village, but not in the way anyone expected. They approached damaged houses and began to help repair them, British soldiers in military uniforms kneeling in the dirt to lift fallen beams, to collect scattered belongings, to right overturned furniture. When they found an elderly woman struggling to draw water from a well because the pulley system had broken in a recent air raid, two soldiers immediately set to work fixing it, using tools from their own packs, working carefully and efficiently until clean water flowed again. When they discovered children who were clearly malnourished, the soldiers shared their own rations, not tossing food like you might feed animals, but kneeling down, making eye contact, smiling, and offering the food gently, waiting for the children to feel safe enough to accept it. The women watched all of this with a kind of stunned paralysis. Everything they had been told was a lie. Everything they had been prepared for was not happening. The enemy was not acting like an enemy. The invaders were not invading. The soldiers were not soldiers in the way they understood soldiers. Young Sachiko, who had been holding her daughter in a death grip just minutes before, slowly walked toward one of the British soldiers who was trying to communicate with an elderly man about a broken roof. The soldier noticed her approach and immediately stopped what he was doing, turning to face her with that same gentle smile. He said something in English she couldn't understand, but then he made exaggerated gestures of hammering and pointing at the roof. A universal pantomime of, "We can help fix this." Sachiko's eyes filled with tears, and she bowed deeply. A bow of gratitude so profound it came from a place deeper than thought, from a place where terror was transforming into something she couldn't yet name. But there was one woman who was not convinced, who could not let go of her suspicion, who felt that this peaceful facade must be a trick, a cruel prelude to greater horrors to come. Her name was Akemi, and she had lost her husband and two sons in the war. All three of them sent away and never returned. All three of them now just names on wooden memorial tablets. Her grief had hardened into a bitter shell, and her fear had become rage. She emerged from her house with her head held high and her eyes burning with defiance. She walked straight up to Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery and spoke to him in rapid, angry Japanese, words that needed no translation because her tone and her expression communicated everything. She was challenging him, accusing him, demanding to know what game he was playing, insisting that this kindness was a lie, that the cruelty would come later, that they were all fools to trust the smiling faces of men who had bombed their cities and killed their families. Montgomery listened to her with complete focus, not interrupting, not growing angry, just listening with an expression of deep sadness and understanding. When she finished, he spoke again through his interpreter, who had now joined them. "You have lost much," he said through the interpreter's careful translation. "You have every right to your anger and your pain. Nothing I do today will bring back those you have lost. Nothing I say will erase the suffering this war has caused. I do not ask you to forgive or to forget. I only ask you to see that we are choosing, right now, in this moment, not to add to the suffering. We are choosing to act with honor because honor is not about what you do to your friends. Honor is about what you do to those who have reason to hate you." The interpreter struggled slightly with the translation, trying to capture the weight of Montgomery's words, but the essence came through. Akemi stared at him, her body trembling with emotion so complex it was tearing her apart. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him because hate was all that had kept her going through the unbearable losses. But his eyes, those steady, sad eyes, that had seen too much death and had decided to choose life wherever he could, those eyes would not allow her to cast him as the monster she needed him to be. Something inside her began to crack, not breaking her, but breaking through to her, letting in light where there had been only darkness. And then Montgomery did something extraordinary. He told her his story, speaking slowly so the interpreter could keep up. He told her about his own son, a boy named William, just 17 years old, who had lied about his age to enlist, who had been killed in the first months of the war in France, whose body Montgomery had never been able to recover or bury properly. He told her about coming home on leave and finding his wife nearly destroyed by grief, about the empty chair at their dinner table, about the unbearable weight of a parent outliving a child. He told her that he understood loss, that he understood rage, that he understood the desire to make someone pay for the pain. But he also told her that he had learned something in the years since his son's death. He had learned that the only way to honor the dead was to protect the living. He had learned that victory without mercy was not victory at all, but just more death wearing a different uniform. He had learned that if this war was going to mean anything, if all these millions of deaths were going to serve any purpose whatsoever, it would only be if the survivors chose to build something better than what had been destroyed. By the time he finished speaking, Akemi was weeping openly, and so were many of the other women who had gathered close enough to hear. The interpreter was crying too, his voice breaking as he translated Montgomery's final words. Fumiko, the elderly village leader, approached with slow, dignified steps and bowed to Montgomery with the deepest respect, a bow reserved for honored guests and revered teachers. She spoke, and the interpreter translated, "We were taught that you were demons. We were told that you would destroy us. But you have shown us that the true demons are fear and hatred, and you have destroyed those demons with kindness. You have taught us that there are men of honor in every uniform, and that peace is not weakness but the greatest strength of all." Montgomery bowed in return, and then something remarkable happened. Other British soldiers began to bow to the Japanese women, and the women bowed back, and in that small village on that August day in 1945, in the aftermath of one of history's most devastating wars, human beings on opposite sides of an unspeakable conflict found a way to see each other not as enemies, but as people. The children, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted from terror to something else, began to emerge from hiding. A small boy approached one of the red-haired British soldiers and offered him a small carved wooden toy, a tiger, something precious in a place where almost nothing remained. The soldier accepted it with reverence, his eyes glistening, and pulled from his pocket a chocolate bar, breaking it in half and giving part to the boy and part to the boy's little sister who had appeared beside him. Over the following weeks, as the occupation continued, these British soldiers became not occupiers but neighbors, not conquerors but helpers. They worked alongside the villagers to rebuild, to plant new crops, to restore what war had broken. They shared their food, their medicine, their labor. They learned Japanese words and taught English words, and through the broken bridge of imperfect communication, they built something that propaganda had said was impossible: friendship across the chasm of war. Montgomery himself spent hours with Fumiko and other village leaders, listening to their stories, understanding their culture, showing respect for their traditions even as he represented the authority of the occupation. He attended a memorial service for the village's war dead. Standing solemnly alongside grieving families, his presence a statement that even enemies could honor each other's losses. The story of that village spread. Other villages heard about the British soldiers who smiled instead of scowled, who helped instead of hurt, who chose dignity over domination. The propaganda machine had failed because reality had contradicted it so completely. Japanese civilians who had been prepared to hate found themselves confused, then cautiously hopeful, then grateful. They learned that the enemy was not monolithic, that uniforms did not define souls, that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there were individuals who chose to act with nobility and grace, and the British soldiers themselves were transformed by the experience. They had expected to occupy a conquered people and instead found themselves welcomed as liberators from fear itself. They learned that mercy was not a sign of weakness but a demonstration of strength, that the true test of character is not how you treat those who love you, but how you treat those who have reason to fear you. Years later, when historians interviewed survivors from that village, they told the story the same way every time. They spoke of the day the British soldiers came, of how they had expected screams and violence and horror, of how they had been prepared for the worst day of their lives. And then they spoke of the silence, the stunned, absolute silence when those soldiers smiled, when they bowed, when they showed kindness instead of cruelty. Not a single scream, the survivors would say. We had prepared to scream, to cry out in terror and pain. But there was not a single scream. There was only silence, and then wonder, and then tears of relief and gratitude. They taught us that peace is a choice, And that day, they chose peace. This is the power of unexpected kindness. This is the revolutionary force of choosing dignity when you have every excuse to choose revenge. Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery and his soldiers could have behaved differently. They had the power, the authority, the justification from a world that would have understood if they had been harsh, if they had been cold, if they had treated the defeated with contempt. No one would have blamed them, but they chose something harder and infinitely more important. They chose to be the kind of men who smile at terrified women and bow to their enemies and show that victory does not require you to diminish others, that strength includes gentleness, that true honor means acting with integrity, especially when no one would judge you for doing otherwise. The lesson here transcends that village, that war, that moment in history. This is a lesson about the human capacity to rise above our circumstances. 2. Choose compassion when anger would be easier, to extend grace when judgment would be justified. In our own lives, we face smaller versions of this choice every single day. When someone wrongs us, do we respond with escalation or with measured dignity? When we have power over others, do we use it to dominate or to uplift? When we encounter people who have been taught to fear us, to hate us, to see us as threats, do we confirm their worst expectations, or do we surprise them with something better? The British soldiers in that Japanese village remind us that we are not prisoners of what others expect from us. We can shatter expectations. We can break cycles. We can be the person who smiles when others expect cruelty, who extends a hand when others expect a fist, who builds bridges when others expect walls. This story also teaches us about the corrosive poison of propaganda and the healing power of truth. Those Japanese women had been systematically lied to, their fears deliberately cultivated and amplified, their view of the enemy deliberately dehumanized, and when they finally encountered the actual human beings behind the propaganda, the lies shattered instantly. This is why fear-mongering and dehumanization are so dangerous, because they prepare us for a reality that may not exist. They prime us to respond with hostility to people who might actually offer friendship. They rob us of the chance to see our common humanity. In our modern world, we are constantly bombarded with messages designed to make us fear each other, to see each other as threats, to retreat into our separate corners. But this story reminds us to question those messages, to seek direct human connection, to test our assumptions against reality, and to always remember that the person on the other side of any divide is a person, not a caricature, not a statistic, but a human being with hopes and fears, and the capacity for both suffering and kindness. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think differently about conflict, about kindness, about the choices we make when we have power over others, then I want you to do something for me. First, hit that like button because stories like this need to be shared, they need to spread, they need to remind us of what is possible when we choose to be better than our worst impulses. Second, leave a comment telling me about a time when someone surprised you with unexpected kindness, or a time when you chose to show grace when you could have chosen anger. These stories matter. They inspire others. They create ripples that spread further than we can imagine. Third, subscribe to this channel because I am committed to bringing you more stories like this. Stories that challenge us, that move us, that remind us of the best parts of human nature even in the darkest circumstances. And finally, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is struggling with anger or fear or the weight of judgment. Someone who needs to be reminded that peace is possible, that transformation is real, that we can always choose to be better than we were yesterday.